I'm excited to share my conversation with Howard Green. Howard is the founding member of Business News Network in Canada, now BNN Bloomberg. He has interviewed some of the greatest CEOs in the business world, and he has authored 3 best-selling books. The last one being one of my favorites, Railroader, The Unfiltered Genius and Controversy of 4-time CEO Hunter Harrison. We discuss Hunter's key insights as an operator and what drove him to turn around 4 major railroads over the span of 2 decades. We also discuss the impetus for the current acquisition of Kansas City Southern after a dormant railroad M&A landscape for nearly 2 decades. Hope you enjoy my conversation with Howard Green. So Howard, thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure and a privilege to be speaking with you today. And I'm looking forward to spending the next few minutes, talking about all the different things.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Amol. Nice to meet you. Go ahead, ask away.
Yeah, same here. So, actually the first thing I thought about was you've had such a long career at the intersection of business and journalism. So how did that actually come about?
In a funny way, by default. Well, I did a minor, and I should say I did a minor in economics in university. I majored in journalism, but I did a minor in economics. So I always had an abiding interest in business. And then I was probably about 7 years into my career, and I left the job that I had, and I wanted another, whatever job I got next. I wanted to be a network job. I didn't want to go back to local television. And the only network show that would hire me was the business program at Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, a program called Venture. And it was a great place to work. I contributed to that program for about 10 years. And so that was in 1988 when I started there. So it just led to me being more and more fascinated in the kinds of stories that could be told about the business world, the economic world, the entrepreneurial world, and so forth. And funnily enough, the fellow who had hired me there, he went on to write the application for the first business television channel in Canada, the only one actually. It's now affiliated with Bloomberg. It's called BNN Bloomberg. Back when I worked for it, it was BNN, Business News Network. But he wrote the application. I participated in the application to the regulator, and then when it launched in, I guess, 1999, I started there the first day. So the combination of my work previously under him at the CBC, and then moving into helping start up the first business channel here, as I said, the only one, gave me a unique view into the business world and access to a lot of people that I otherwise wouldn't have had access to. And as a result, my books have come out of that experience. The TD Bank book was my first one, Charles Bronfman's memoir, the second one, and then of course Railroader, the one you're interested in. They all came out of my television experience, meeting those people through television initially. And so that's how it kind of happened. Short story.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. So you've talked about your 3 books. Railroader, to me, is just a phenomenal business book. Highly recommend, anyone pick it up, read it, because I really enjoyed it, and I've read it now multiple times. But
thank you.
When it comes to writing a book, it seems like such a difficult project. It requires the kind of detail that you've gone into, the events that happened maybe 30 or 40 years ago. How do you research that into that type of detail? And when it comes to putting all that stuff together, what's the part that you enjoy the most? And there's always, with things we do, there's always that 20% you're like, oh, I'm not looking forward to doing that. So what is that part? And how do you sort of compartmentalize all those things in, publishing something that's just so beautiful and incredible?
Well, first of all, thank you for your kind words and for reading it more than once. It's It's lonely work, I have to tell you. It's you talk to a lot of people. You talk to the main characters. You talk to all of the supporting characters and other people who have minor roles, and they lead you to this person and that person, and so it's an iterative process. I mean, you have a plan, but then things happen, and you go off plan. You go down a path here, a path there, and so forth. For instance, in the book Railroader, you might recall there's a person I write about. I think she appears somewhere in the first 50 pages, Sue Rathie. She's now a cancer researcher in Minnesota. She worked with Hunter Harrison, the subject of this book, the 4-time rail CEO, back at Burlington Northern Santa Fe, and then later at Illinois Central. And she was a computer programmer.
Yeah.
She had started as a punch card operator. And it's funny, the editor of the book, Amanda Lewis, when I wrote that, she said, "What's a punch card operator?" Amanda's in her late 30s, so she'd never heard of what a punch card operator was. So I had to do a footnote about what a punch card operator is. Generational issues arise for different audiences, So anyhow, Sue was a wonderful programmer, and she worked closely with Hunter, and was working with algorithms back in the 80s, decision tables for how a boxcar would move through the system and whether it would get there according to the trip plan and so forth. And while Hunter wasn't much of a computer guy himself, he was a data guy. He loved the data, and she could provide it. And so that person came to me to get to the answer of your question. I was talking to somebody somewhere who had been mentioned to me by someone else, someone in the United States who'd worked with Hunter on the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Rail, or Burlington Northern Railroad back then. And he mentioned Sue to me. So I found a number for Sue, and I called her. So, one thing leads to another. I'm sure in your research for investments, one thing leads to another. You see something, well, I haven't followed that path. And sometimes it's a waste of time, but other times it's gold. And she was gold. Finding Sue was gold. There were 3 or 4 very important pages in there, in my view, which really speak to the roots of precision schedule railroading, which is the philosophy for which Hunter's known. And it's very interesting. Mark Wallace, who was Hunter's chief of staff at 3 railroads, CNCP and CSX, now an top executive at CSX, he said to me, that was amazing. I'd never heard of her. And he'd worked so closely with Hunter. And I remember emailing Hunter about that. I said, I was talking to Sue Rathie, and she sends her best. And he said, "How'd you find her?" He had never mentioned, he worked with so many people over the years and that was so long ago. But anyway, it's a long answer to your question, but there are, there are the big parts, setting the focus of it, doing the chapter outline, which kind of forms the GPS of the book, so you don't get lost. But then there are those minor tributaries that you go down, and you find amazing things.
Yeah. So I guess we can talk a little bit more about, the book is really about, how genius operates, and all the good and the not so good that comes with, these one of a kind people.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about it, I, as an investor for now, maybe 12, 13, 14 years, I've met lots of very good CEOs, and there's a very small percentage that are just, truly outstanding. And there's something very unique about each one of them. What, as much time as you got to spend with Hunter Harrison, what do you think were his qualities, whether tangible or intangible, that sort of made him that just completely larger than life, unique business person?
Well, I think he found something in which he could excel. Excelling became extremely important to him. I think, going back to the demons that floated around in his head with regard to his relationship with his father, which was a very difficult relationship early on, although later they did reconcile. Unfortunately, he died, I think, when Hunter was about 31, 32. So he didn't see him rise to the level of CEO, but he did predict that Hunter would run a railroad eventually. I don't think anybody could have predicted he would run four,
Yeah.
but he did. He did. He saw the potential in him, but he was extraordinarily frustrated by him because of Hunter's behavior as a young man. And so I think Hunter, once he decided to apply himself, it wasn't as though he had any particular love for railroads. He could make more money there than the bakery where he's making 50 cents an hour. But once he got there, he saw it in a way that other people perhaps didn't see it, even people who had worked there a long time. There was a film, I don't know if you're aware of it, but it's a long time ago, Rain Man, with Dustin Hoffman and Tom Cruise. And Dustin Hoffman, I think, I don't know what his condition was, perhaps somewhere on the autism spectrum, but he had an incredible mind for mathematics. He could do computations, complex computations in his head, and Tom Cruise was his brother. And it was kind of a savant-like ability. And I think Hunter had that kind of savant-like ability when it came to railroads. He could see them in 3 dimensions. He could see how they operated, and he could see how to make them much more efficient, move boxcars much more efficiently than anybody else. And over time, he developed a granular understanding of railroads that was really incomparable. Maybe Keith Creel at CP is similar in that regard now. He was protégé of Hunter. Yeah. But and that added to Hunter's abilities to operate. But I think on the other side, going back to these psychological factors, he had an uncompromising way about him. He was going to do it, by God, no matter what. And he had an unbending will. He was unwilling to do the unpopular thing, or sorry, rather, he was willing to do the unpopular thing, which is very rare. It's a very hard thing to do because most people want to be liked, want to be loved. And I think he did too, but he was a zealot. It was like he was a missionary, and he was going to do it no matter what, and damn the consequences, because in his mind, there was only one way. There was the right way, and it was his way. If you weren't on his track, you were in trouble. So he pushed himself. He always pushed himself. I think probably, and this is armchair psychologist Howard talking here, probably because of that difficult relationship that he had with his father. He was always trying to prove himself in a way, and he couldn't stop. As you know, having read the book, and people who followed the story, he kept working until he passed away. He had he worked, he was there. He died with his boots on, as they say, and running that 4th railroad CSX when he was very, very ill, and it was very controversial. His family was torn about him continuing to work, but he had to keep doing it. There was something in him. He was addicted to it, and the identity associated with being CEO. He could do something better than anybody else. So it was a sense of purpose. He needed that sense of purpose going back to his childhood, many factors. And I think he also felt it would keep him alive if he kept working. So he was a complicated guy. And there are a lot of factors, I think, which drove him to do what he did. But that's probably the best way I can sum it up, at least from what I remember this morning.
Yeah, no, and the other thing I was thinking about was, I think there's a mention in your book when he started CSX, and there was also always this, maybe it was an excuse, I'm not sure what it was, but it was, they called it a spaghetti type network, given the East Coast presence, and I remember the comment, he said, "Hey, we're just going to eat the spaghetti." and for lunch and clean it all up.
Yeah.
So he almost had a very different way of thinking about, the operating structure. And I'm just
Yes.
curious as to how that even came about, because, starting in his early days when that was sort of the status quo.
Yeah.
What was in him that made him have this such a different takeaway of a problem, which I think the convention looked at in a standard way?
That's a really good question. And that's something I should have mentioned in the last answer. He had a questioning mind. He never took something at face value. He always wanted to know why, ever since he was a kid. If things didn't add up to him, he would ask why. Why not? How? Those very simple questions can elicit very powerful answers. And I think that was one of the reasons he was so successful. He did not have he didn't have an MBA. He didn't have an Ivy school
Right.
pedigree. He took a couple of years of classes at the college in Memphis, but he dropped out. But he was incredibly intelligent because he had a very fine mind that functioned very well and was always questioning the status quo, to use your phraseology. And so, when he went to that first railroad he worked at, when he started, he was 19. He started as a low-level laborer pouring oil into the wheels of rail cars in Memphis. There was this guy there, and said to him, "Don't work too hard. Sweeping, driving, cleaning, it all pays the same."
Mm-hmm.
And he thought to myself, that's not the right way to look at this. You got to be motivated. You got to try to do better. And so he admitted he became a taskmaster ultimately when he became a supervisor, because if he felt people weren't putting in the 8 hours of work, they were darn well going to do it under him. That was their duty to the company. That was his view. So I think, going back to that questioning mind, that was a key, right? He always, and in that example, when he went to CSX of the spaghetti network, when you look at that map of their network in the eastern half of the United States, that's what it looks like. But when Hunter looked at it, he saw a geometrical figure, not quite a square, but a four-sided figure. Albany, New York was one corner of it. Somewhere in Ohio was another corner of it. Nashville was another corner of it. And Waycross, Georgia was another corner of it. So he looked at that spaghetti and he thought, this is a square. And so if we optimize that four-sided figure and kind of forget about the rest, not forget, but don't prioritize it, prioritize that four-sided figure, we're going to do a hell of a lot better. So it was that, I think I wrote in the book, simplicity that captures complexity. And that, I think, was one of his strongest attributes.
Yeah, it's almost like where everyone saw, adversity or a blockage, it is always an opportunity for him. There was a different way of framing the problem where and I think we can see that with all greatness in any different field, business, sports, medicine, is where, regular people like me see adversity. These folks see opportunity and they frame it in such a different way that it's just simple and there's beauty behind it.
Yeah. And people say, well, precision scheduled railroading is this or it's that, as they try to sum it up, running the trains on time, running them longer, running them faster, and all that kind of stuff. But from his point of view, it was more about continuous improvement. And, people who, said to him that, well, you couldn't improve it because that's the way they always did it. Well, he'd look at, and he wrote this in his famous manuals at CN, people thought ice cream was a mature business until Haagen-Dazs came along. People thought coffee was a mature business until Starbucks came along. And both those companies looked at those businesses in different ways. And he looked at railroading, a business that goes back to the 1800s, in a different way.
Yeah. So, so he had success at, I guess, by 2015, three different companies, sort of three different levels of scale. And I was just comparing that, and I thought about, hey, that's like a coach winning, three championships with three different teams and three different leagues. And and but there was a lot of resistance, and this was maybe much more of a Canadian thing, the way it was perceived. But most U.S. railroads, wasn't until 2018 that they really sort of fully adopted PSR, precision scheduled railroading. Why was there such a sort of pushback against this philosophical way of doing business? Because the results sort of spoke for themselves. I think everybody should have been copying this blueprint without any hesitation.
Yeah, that question got asked a lot. And really, I think when you say 2018, I think that's a significant date, because he died at the end of 2017, just after he'd gone to CSX. He was only there for 9 months, but they were starting to see the early results of that turnaround. It was very rough. I mean, a lot of people lost their jobs. He was a very polarizing figure, and he is to this day. And so I think that that's part of it. People thought, it was rough. There were a lot of customer complaints, because he forced the customers to show up with their product when he said the train was going to leave, which was the opposite of the way it had always had been. He was a disruptor, and it's hard to be a disruptor. It's hard to do the unpopular thing, and it was unpopular in certain quarters, for sure. So I think that the companies probably didn't want that trouble. They were chugging along, and that was the way it was going to be. They also didn't have the kind of hard-headed figure running their railroads that Hunter was, who also, by the way, combined it with mentoring and teaching. He ran the famous Hunter camps at CN, put thousands of mid-level railroaders through there, teaching them leadership and how to run railroads. He took a lot of pride in that, changing the culture of the organization. And he did a few at CSX before he died, 4 of them. I was at the last one about a week and a half before he died. He did it while plugged into an oxygen machine, talking without notes for 5 or 6 hours in this big ballroom at the Breakers in Florida. So there was resistance at those other companies, for sure. I think maybe they didn't want to be embarrassed. Like, we've been doing it wrong. If you have to adopt somebody else's way of doing it, that's an admission that you haven't been doing it right for all these years. But I think it just became so incontrovertible by the time he went to CSX. He'd done it at Illinois Central. He did it at CN. He did it at CP in a shorter time frame, a much shorter time frame. The results, the financial and shareholding results and efficiency results you couldn't argue with them. And then he's going to CSX to do this too. And the stock went up 24% overnight just on the rumor that this guy was going there. If you're running one of those other railroads, your big shareholders are starting to say, WTF, there's something going on here. And by the way, some of those shareholders were the same shareholders at these railroads, some of the biggest. So I think the pressure probably became too much for these other Class 1 railroads to adopt some form of precision scheduled railroading.
Yeah. So, as I think in each of these iterations, the headcount or the employee count in most of these companies have probably dropped by 30 to 40% on average, let's say a third. you as a journalist, how do you think about that? As you know, there's a prism of shareholder value, and then there's sort of when you think about stakeholder success. You know, where do you fall on that?
That's another fascinating question. It's and I think the stakeholder point of view has come to the fore much more since Hunter passed away. The Business Roundtable put out that statement in the summer of 2019. I can sort of hear Hunter reacting to that in my head, you know. Yeah, right, you know. Until, I mean, he believed in doing the right thing in his mind, but it might not necessarily. I mean, he was a big believer, and he stated quite clearly that he thought, and this was when he was at Canadian Pacific, and it took some guts to say this, given that that company's based in Alberta and it's an oil producing province. But he said, you know, the fossil fuels are on their way out, you know, and you're not going to be relying on coal. And, you know, he wasn't crazy about shipping oil. He did it because the common carrier obligation required him to do it. But he wasn't crazy about shipping oil, and you know, he wasn't crazy about shipping what he called more dangerous substances, hazardous substances in rail cars, on trains. But that was the law. So you know, he was a man of his time, and his time was one of increasing shareholder value.
Yeah.
He was very interested in making money for shareholders, but also for himself. You know, he grew up with no luxuries, and he wanted them. And this was a place he could make money. And, you know, the shareholders hired him to make money. The people who ran Illinois Central were private equity people. What do private equity people do? They go in and they shake a place up to make more money. And the guy they hired to shake it up was Hunter Harrison. And then CN, you know, wanted to make more money. And so they hired Hunter Harrison. They bought Illinois Central, but part of the deal was Hunter Harrison came to Montreal. And both Paul Tellier and Michael Sabia, who were running Canadian National then, legendary civil servants in this country prior to running the railroad. Michael, by the way, now is the Deputy Minister of Finance in the Trudeau government. Yeah. Just wrote the federal budget and negotiated with the airlines on the bailout since he retired from running the big pension fund in Quebec. They both said to me, you know, they hired him. They hired this guy. And Paul said to me, you know, he thought the world of Hunter's railroading ability, but he thought he was too tough on people. How come you only yell at Keith Creel and Gordon Trafton? Tellier said to Hunter. And Gordon Trafton was another executive who's on the board of CP now. And he said, because I don't have to yell at them. So, you know, and Michael Sabia, who was CFO of CN, ran Bell Canada, and then ran this big, huge pension fund in Quebec, and now is Deputy Minister of Finance. He said to me, you know, Howard, Hunter was amazing, but there's another side to the coin. He said, sometimes I think he was too tough. He said, you know, I worked with Hunter. I had the pleasure of working with Hunter, not for Hunter. And I think they were two very different things. So even those people who hired him had their misgivings about it. But you know what? They all made money. And all those pension funds who work on behalf of people like the ones you described who lost their jobs, they supported them. They hired them because their mandate was to make money. The former chairman of CN, David McLean, told me that, and he you know, he was one of the ones who said, Hunter, you're done in the end of 2009. And there's a quote in the book, we got tired of all these guys calling up saying he wanted to kick this guy's ass off the railroad. So they were tired of Hunter's ways there. But McLean told me that when Hunter went to CSX, he bought shares in CSX. You know, so you tell me, people talk and then they do something else. So look, it is polarizing. I've had plenty of notes from people who won't read the book, or think he was a bully, and this and that. And there are two camps when it comes to Hunter. There's no in between. There are those who were true believers, and they did well under him. There are lots of people who, locomotive engineers or supervisors who held stock in those companies, and they put their kids through school, or they built new houses or whatever. And then there are those who lost their job, and that's terrible. And, I feel for those people. And so I think that it's, for better or for worse, that is the system under which we work, and under which he worked and prospered. And as much as the people at the Business Roundtable want to talk about stakeholder capitalism, look at what's happened to CEO compensation during the pandemic. Has it gone down? I don't think so. Yeah. They may have capped their base salaries, but not in their options or bonus. So the aggregate numbers, they're up.
Yeah.
Well, millions of people have been out of work or suffering because of the pandemic. So, is there really stakeholder capitalism? Is all of this ESG stuff resulting in meaningful progress towards net zero? I don't know. You tell me.
Yeah. See, my day job is to, maximize my investors' return, right? And so clearly the Hunter Harrisons of the world are very beneficial to people in my seat. But even me as an investor, you struggle with some of those things at the edge. Like, what is too much, right? How much efficiency is too much? That's the right answer to that.
Yeah, I'd say in response to that, one, Laird Pitts, who I mentioned in the book, he was a longtime friend of Hunter's. They knew each other. They were only a few days apart in age, actually, and Laird was running the chief risk officer and running the police force at CP when they last worked together, and had been at CN prior. But he said to me in an interview, and I quoted it in the book, how much is enough when you're running a publicly traded company? How much is too much? Yeah. So exactly that question that you raise. And I think also, and this leads us to the M&A activity that we're seeing now, both CP and CN competing to buy Kansas City Southern. I think one of the underlying reasons that you're seeing this now, even though CN has wanted it for a long time, and CP has had designs on American railroads for some time. All of them look at each other constantly. It's been 20 years of frustration that they couldn't do a deal. But I think now you've seen, as a result of all of the major railroads, except for the one owned by Buffett, BNSF, have adopted some form of precision scheduled railroading. They've all become financially more efficient through that philosophy, or various forms of it, getting their so-called operating ratios down to levels previously thought to be unimaginable.
Yeah.
And so I think Jim Foote, who's running CSX now, he took over when Hunter died, and he's a former CN guy. He said, you can get your operating ratio down to 50, but you won't have a railroad left. You won't have a company left.
Yeah.
So they seem to be operating now around 60, some are at 58, but basically say 60. When Hunter went into CP, it was at 81, I think. 81, I can't remember the exact figure. When CN went public, I think it was 97. It was, I mean, these numbers were very high, meaning the profit margin was very low. It's expenses over revenue is the ratio for those who are unfamiliar. So now that they've got it down to that kind of, they're all in that vicinity now, the main ones. So what do you do next? You have to grow. The top number, the expenses, you can't, how much more can you reduce those? Well, maybe some certain efficiencies from technology, whatever. But as you say, from a headcount point of view, probably no. In fact, I think some of them are hiring again. But the bottom number, the revenue, how do you grow that? Well, you grow it by buying another railroad, or you grow it by stealing market share from trucks. So I think that, the question that you ask leads to what we're seeing now in certain respects.
Yeah, so it's, I think just to maybe put it in context for whoever's watching, we're talking about, operating margins going from 5 to 10% to literally 40 to 45% over 2 decades. I mean, this is a incredible increase in cash flow per share, earnings per share. And I think I have it somewhere. I think CP's earnings per share probably went from maybe $2 a share to, I would say, I could be wrong, but $5 or $6 a share over a course of those 4 years that Hunter Harrison was the CEO. So 21 to maybe 2016. It's incredible increase in earnings per share. But to go back to why do you think 2021 is the year that we reignite railroad M&A, which has literally been dormant, as you said, for 2 decades?
Well, I don't know is the short answer, but let me take a guess. And I think there are probably a few factors. One, Joe Biden is president now. When Donald Trump was president, Mexico was seen in a different way. Biden is trying to make nice with his North American neighbors, Canada and Mexico, whereas Donald Trump didn't, care too much about neighbors. It was more about what was happening inside the United States. And so I think under the current political administration, there's a stronger rationale for building a 3-country rail network for all of the potential that exists in trade between the 3 countries, which in fact perhaps has more potential because it's more difficult to do business with China these days. And as a result, there is a trend that's developed, so-called onshoring or nearshoring, whereby instead of having cheap labor offshore doing things, then it's closer to home, i.e. Mexico, or cheaper labor. And there's a lot of auto parts, for instance, that travel between the 2 countries, just to name one product that gets shipped on rails. So I think the political environment, the trade environment, the geopolitical environment vis-a-vis North America and China, all of those factors play into why now is a good time. Debt is also very cheap, and both CP and CN need to take on some debt in order to do this. They're at CP and CN both have been talking about how they can grow. Keith Creel, who runs CP, Hunter's protégé, is an American. he was chief operating officer at CN. So he knows that back in the day, CN wanted to buy it. Hunter was never crazy about Kansas City Southern, but he have changed his mind under current circumstances. But Keith is a young guy. He's in his early 50s. He's aggressive. And I think he probably wants to do something that, Hunter couldn't do. He's often spoke of as Hunter's protege, but he's his own guy. And he's a very successful CEO now in his own right. He's been there for almost 5 years at CP. And, I think he wants to put his stamp on things. And this would be a crowning achievement in order to consummate this acquisition of Kansas City Southern. And it, when you look at it, it makes eminent sense. And CN was started on that route when it bought, or route, depending on whether you're American or Canadian, route. Hunter used to make fun of the way I'd say it. Anyway, when they bought Illinois Central, that was, to take advantage of NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. That was Paul Tellier's vision, Michael Sabia's vision alongside him. And, Tellier wanted to buy Kansas City Southern back in the day, 20 odd years ago, and Hunter waved him off. But so I think, from CN's point of view, they've already gone down that path, and they want to do more. So I think there are a number of reasons why it's all kind of happened now. And of course, there's a rivalry between them. CN was probably very frustrated when it saw that CP made the first bid, and it was a friendly deal. We got to do something. We can't let them have it. So that's a whole other dimension to this.
So I want to touch on that too, but while you brought up Keith Creel, Hunter's, I guess, protege, in what way is he different in his sort of management style or philosophy than Hunter Harrison, do you think?
Well, at his core, he's a railroader. He's an operator, and probably, I mean, people more knowledgeable about it than me say he's the best operator in the business now amongst the class ones in North America. So that is his outstanding quality by far. I think he's also learned from Hunter's mistakes. And one of Hunter's mistakes was that, as Paul Tellier said, he was awful at government relations. Paul was, basically ran the Canadian government under Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, the top official in the Canadian government, not a cabinet minister, but running the bureaucracy, which is not an insignificant thing to run. And so he knew government relations, and he respected the notion of government relations. Of course, Hunter had no time for it. And as I wrote in the book, the attempt by CP under Hunter to buy Norfolk Southern essentially blew up, because it ended up a very hostile situation, but it went nowhere because he didn't pay heed to playing the political game in Washington. There was a Canadian railroad trying to buy a railroad that runs right through Washington, D.C., Homeland Security issues, so forth, competitive issues. And he was, he just thought, well, it makes total sense from a railroading point of view. So why would anybody argue? Well, they did, and Norfolk Southern had much better government relations, and ultimately the U.S. military and the U.S. Justice Department were critical of CP's bid, and that was the end of it. And people on CP's board told me, and I quoted them in the book, and Mark Wall, they were very frustrated with Hunter because he did not follow advice on government relations. And so I think probably, and I don't know the inside of what's happening now, but I think you saw it in the first release from CP when they announced their deal with Kansas City Southern, that one train is equal to 400 trucks, and bringing those trucks off the road, and so 4 times less emissions. They're hitting those notes. So the congestion issue in Chicago, which is a political issue in Chicago, I think Keith is much more aware or much more respectful of what you have to do on the government relations side than Hunter was. Hunter paid a price for it, and he was ripping mad about it. He said, I forget the quote. It was trying to think what the quote was. It was very funny. He said, "I'm a sore loser, and I haven't mellowed with age," and that was the truth, But he didn't learn from it. He didn't learn that he would have to be a more cognizant practitioner of government relations if he was going to try and buy a railroad, in the United States. So I think Keith's learned from that.
Yeah. Who do you think is the loser in this I mean, you have let's say 2 railroads combining, you have competitors, you have shippers. Is there a loser in this combination?
Again, that's hard to say. I think, look, CN could win it and then have trouble with the integration. That occurs in big transactions. Who knows? Buying these companies is one thing, but then integrating them and then operating them successfully, in either case with CP or CN, that is a hard job. And so, and of course, expectations will be very high because the price being paid for Kansas City Southern is it's an attractive price. Yeah. I think the winners clearly are shareholders of Kansas City Southern. Now in CN's case, they bought Illinois Central and they integrated it very well. They bought Wisconsin Central and they integrated it. They bought BC Rail, they integrated it. They bought the EJ&E around Chicago under Hunter and they integrated it. But these were smaller. Illinois Central was, when they bought it, it was probably about half the size of Kansas City Southern now. At the time, they were about the same size, but that's 23 years ago. KCS has grown since then. So these are complicated integrations, I think. And so I think, look, they got their eyes on truckers. That industry will feel more and more pressure from the rails. So I don't know.
Yeah, it'll be fascinating to see how this plays out over the next couple of years. But so I guess one last question and more bigger picture question, the trade war started by, President Trump. It's now become a bipartisan issue here, I think, in the US in terms of Biden supporting it. How do you think this thing plays out over the next 10 years based on your experience, based on your, your interviews with other business folks? What's the outcome here over the next decade, you think?
More fights, I think, is probably a reasonable answer. Look, as long as I covered business, softwood lumber has been a trade irritant between the two countries. If I never hear about softwood lumber again, I'd be thrilled, But it is, they protect their interests on both sides of the border. The Canadian dairy industry is an issue for people outside the country. local and regional interests will always come to the fore. There was a very, very well respected Canadian ambassador to the United States when Ronald Reagan was president, and then George H.W. Bush. His name was Alan Gottlieb, and he died last year. And I knew Alan, and I interviewed him a number of times over the year. Alan always said that, well, I mean, you had to have personal relationships in the administration, in the White House, but also in Congress, because of Congress's power. And Canadians, he said, were going to get more trouble from northern politicians, i.e. congressmen and women from northern states and senators from northern states, than they would from southern states, funnily, because they were on the border, and there were issues between them, so it's always a dance. There's, I'm reading John Boehner's book now, and get an insight into congressional stuff. And as long as there's politics, there's going to be trade wars. And it's we don't know. There's going to be an election in Canada probably in the next year or two, because we have a minority government. Who knows who wins? Who knows what priorities get put on what? So there are always you'll have a midterm election in another year and a half, and things will change, and there'll be more fights. So you can guarantee it.
I mean, do you think we're going to see a real bifurcation in supply chains where I guess I think the impetus for the KSU acquisition is that opportunity in Mexico, which will really increase, let's say, over the next 5 to 10 years, as a lot of these supply chains do come, get out of China or the Far East, come close to the United States, and talking about, a lot more investment here in the United States or in Canada. Do you think that's more likely to happen?
Again, I hesitate to make predictions. What I will say is that I think supply chains, because of the pandemic, have probably had, they probably strengthened greatly out of necessity. I mean, the world functions amazingly, and has through this remarkably well, given what has occurred over the last 14 months, with borders closed and things like that. And that's a huge issue for Canada and the United States, by the way. I mean, the kind of easy flow over the border has been just one of the great miracles of modern geopolitics and society, to have that long and undefended border and have goods and services flowing across there, on a second by second basis. It's staggering. So what that's allowed for our two economies. But I think the supply chain strengthening as a result of the pandemic, more and more, a very rapid shift by many companies to the cloud, who had been hesitant about the cloud and so forth, all of that. Now that presents risks too, when it's all in the cloud. I mean, we look at what happened with the Colonial Pipeline. I don't know. I mean, the world continues to surprise me. Who would have, nobody predicted, or very few people predicted 9/11. Very few people thought we'd see the kind of spinning down the drain of the financial system in 2008. Very few people, other than, say, a Bill Gates that I'm aware of, were predicting a global pandemic that would virtually shut down the world for months at a time. So, to predict what's going to happen 10 years out, who knows?
Yeah. So I guess we'll close on what are the characteristics that you look for in sort of a compelling project, a book or documentary? What is it that catches you or compels you to start, writing?
The people, I think, with the TD book, it was the people, the TD Bank. I don't know if you have TD Bank in Louisiana. I don't think you do, but it's all up and down the
Yeah, we don't.
eastern seaboard of the United States. And of course, if you remember TD Ameritrade, that was TD Bank owned for it. TD, by the way, stands for Toronto Dominion. A lot of people in the United States thought it stood for touchdown or the first two initials of Mr. Bank's name, so like JP Morgan. Anyway, it was the people, I met those people and I became, enthralled with their story, with Charles Bronfman and Seagram, liquor dynasty, Charles, and that story of what happened to that family and the family dynamics that led to the unraveling of this incredible company. And then Hunter, and like a character like no other. I mean, I think it should, Railroader should be a movie. I've actually written a screenplay for it. So if you know anybody who's interested in wanting to make the movie, get them in touch with me. Or maybe you want to buy the rights. Anyway, so you need compelling people. When I did the Swiss Air 111 documentary, it was about 20 years ago, the film on the crash of that plane that left New York on the way to Geneva and crashed off the coast of Nova Scotia into the ocean while it was on fire, and 229 people died. It was the people of the investigative team that I followed for 4 years to figure out what happened to that aircraft so that they could prevent it happening to other people like you and me or our families, people we know. So it really comes down to the people. And I think, Hunter made that point. We were sitting in his office one day and we had CNBC on, and the guys on Squawk Box were shooting their mouths off about this or that. And Hunter was like shaking his head. He said, they don't think about the people. He said, they look at the industry, and the sectors, but they don't think about the people, the Hunter Harrisons that come along and change an industry. Mm-hmm. And I think there's, whether you love them or hate them, whatever side you're on, when it comes to Hunter, and there are people on both sides, and I see both perspectives. People do make a difference. They change things. Steve Jobs changed things. Zuckerberg, whether you like him or not, changed things. Bezos changed things. So,
yeah,
even though there's all this AI out there, people have to create it. It's the people who run the companies.
So I guess we'll close on change, because I think that's the right way. It's, if Jeff Bezos changed the way we live with mobile computing in mobility, and Jeff Bezos has changed retail, and I think Hunter Harrison really brought railroads out of the dark age, and Railroad is sort of this gripping narrative on the life of Hunter Harrison. And I would highly recommend anybody to go out and get the book and read it. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. So thank you very much, Howard, for your time.
Amal, great pleasure speaking with you. Thanks for all your great questions, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you. Likewise.
Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.